in senior sem, and then just to kind of set a tone, this is from the very first page of the very first reading that was assigned to these students. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we accomplished over the course of the semester in our senior sem, and then turn it over to the students. And I promise this will not take very long. It was a book by an author who has written a short little handbook on history. Her name is Rampala, and she wrote this. The historian's goal is not to collect facts about the past, but to acquire insights into the ideas and realities that shape the lives of people of earlier societies. When we study the people of the past, what we are really learning about is the rich diversity of the human experience. A thoughtful examination of the past can tell us a great deal about how we came to be who we are. The effort we put into grappling with the worldviews of earlier societies teaches us to see the world through different eyes. Finally, an understanding of how past events have come to shape the complex problems of our own times can help make us informed decisions about our own future. So with that as an overview of why we study history, the tasks that we undertook in our senior seminar were the following. And tonight you're going to find that the number 8 is very special. We have 8 presenters. There are going to be 8 tasks that we undertook, and there will be an 8-minute intermission. Number 1, the first task was understanding historical questions and identifying a research question. 2 was working with sources to locate both the primary and secondary materials that can assist in answering that research question. 3, learning to question the sources. How reliable are they? How can we use them with scholarly integrity? We included a short reading here discussing fake news as an issue that we are facing right now. Number 4, reading and evaluating the sources to understand the content and the author's intent. 5, writing literature reviews and annotated bibliographies to demonstrate how the student's work fit into this field and how the sources the student has found will contribute to the final paper. Number 6, of central importance, was mastering the art of the elegant essay. How to blend creativity with context, evidence with erudition, grammar with gravitas. Learning the skill of critique is the 7th skill that we undertook here. In our case, meaningful and developmental critique, avoiding the extremes of expletives, or, on the other end, smiley faces, trying to be helpful in our critiques. And then finally, proficiency in presentation, which we hope will be demonstrated by all of our young scholars here tonight. The plan for this evening is for the presentation to begin now with a short, as I said, 8-minute intermission halfway through. The students thought that 8 minutes would be appropriate because of the number of them that there are, right? At the end, there will be a short awards presentation with remarks from Professor Mike Young and Professor Paul Bushnell, and we will then move on to the reception with a broader array of refreshments. We are asking to hold the question and answer until the reception, where the students will be stationed in the area outside there, and they will be available to answer any questions that you have in depth. In addition to that, if any of you would like to have copies of the papers that they have presented, they have a little card that you can sign your name on, and they'll email the paper to you. So let's begin. Let's begin with Matt Benitis.
Yay, Benitis!
Do you have the iPad thing?
Yeah.
Can we put just these lights right in front of
The lights out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, please. Just these. I don't really know if I need a mic.
You do.
I do? Okay, awesome. So hopefully I don't drop this mic because I'm not used to speaking with a mic. But anyway, I'm going to get going here. Hello. Before we get going, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me tonight. My name is Matt Benitis, and the title of my presentation is The Relocation of Bosnian Muslims to St. Louis between 1992 and 1995. Now, how did I become interested in this matter? I mean, it's a pretty specific topic. Well, primarily, I'm very interested in both immigration and international humanitarian law. As such, the relocation of Bosnian Muslim refugees to the St. Louis area throughout the Bosnian War caught my interest. To begin, I'd like to delve into the research question that set the foundation of my project. What led to the Bosnian refugee crisis in Europe and allowed for the relocation of Bosnian Muslim refugees to St. Louis, Missouri? Moreover, how were they received and why did they receive the reception they did once they relocated to the area? In order to answer this question, I first analyzed the historic basis of ethnic conflict in the Balkan region. Before the second half of the 15th century, two primary ethnicities inhabited the Balkans: Croatian Catholics and Serbian Eastern Orthodox Christians. By 1483, though, the Ottoman Empire extended its reach to the region that would later become Bosnia and Herzegovina, noted by the yellow X on the green map on the left. As such, an intense Islamification of the area, which again is illustrated by the green map on the left, added the third chief ethnicity to the mix. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century, the three major ethnicities occupied the same territories within the region that on the eve of the Bosnian War they would still hold. With green representing Bosniak or Bosnian Muslim populated territories, blue representing Croatian Catholic populated territories, and red representing Serbian Eastern Orthodox populated territories, the map on the right illustrates these regional ethnic divides, which would eventually lead the country to the brink of war. But between 1945 and 1980, ethnic rifts in the region that would become Bosnia and Herzegovina were relatively quelled. Why? Under the rule of the man judged by historians as a restrictive, yet benevolent dictator, the communist Yugoslavian state constrained religious activities. Until his death in 1980, for 35 years, Josip Broz Tito, pictured here on the left, kept ethnic rifts between Bosnian Muslims, Croatian Catholics, and Serbian Eastern Orthodox Christians at relative bay. Yet with the death of Tito, a second prominent politician rose to prominence in the Balkan region. In preaching policies of Serbian nationalism, which had been stifled under the Tito regime, in the latter half of the 1980s, Slobodan Milosevic, pictured here on the right, reopened historic rooms between Bosnian Muslims, Croatian Catholics, and Serbian Eastern Orthodox Christians. After years of relative peace under the Tito regime, the nationalist rhetoric preached by Milosevic emboldened pro-Serb supporters and re-exposed the Balkan regions to the historic ethnic rifts of the deep past. These ethnic rifts exploded in spring of 1992. Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence March 1st of 1992. In short, the blue region on this map, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina on the left, advocated for the unified independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Labeled Republika Srpska, the Serb Republic, responded with a push for Serbian independence. The culmination of this push for Serbian independence came on April 1992 when Bosnian Serbs seized Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, thus sparking the Bosnian War. And the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina is pictured there with the red star, Sarajevo. Labeled by historians as the bloodiest catastrophe on the European continent since the Second World War, the Bosnian War displaced over 3 million individuals across the globe. Of these 3 million, approximately 150,000 made their way to the United States. Of these 150,000 displaced individuals, approximately 50,000 Bosnian refugees made their way to the St. Louis area. Now, how is it that 50,000 Bosnian refugees made it to the St. Louis area? After all, historically speaking, though the United States has professed a mythology about its immigration foundation, it has also pushed xenophobic and exclusionary legislation. In 1965, headed by the brother of former President John F. Kennedy, American legislation began to trend towards open hospitality. Under the direction of Teddy Kennedy, pictured there in the top right, the U.S. government enacted a set of 3 immigration reform policies between 1965 and 1990. The Immigration and Nationality Act, the signing of which is pictured in black and white here, with the Kennedy brothers over the left shoulder of the signer of this act, Lyndon B. Johnson, opened the United States to uncharacteristic group of immigrants. For the first time in American history, as opposed to the preference being placed upon white Anglo-Saxon immigrants, the U.S. actively opened its doors to immigrants of color and non-Christian background. In 1980, the Refugee Act, again backed by Teddy Kennedy, established a distinction between the typical immigrant and a refugee. 10 years later, the National Immigration Act increased quota numbers for those allowed into the United States. So by the onset of the Bosnian War, legislation had been enacted by the United States to properly foster the relocation of Bosnian Muslim refugees to the U.S. But again, why St. Louis in specific? In relocating Bosnian refugees within the United States State Department assigns a destination based upon three major characteristics. Primarily, the State Department checks for the presence of an already established group in the community. By 1992, as a result of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, there was already a small presence of Bosnians in the St. Louis area. A dual wave of Bosnian immigration to St. Louis, fostered by the U.S. State Department, ensued, resulting from the presence of both an open job market and readily available housing. As such, the St. Louis area turned out to be the perfect place for the relocation of Bosnian Muslim refugees in the 1990s. The final matter of my research question revolves around the actual reception of Bosnian Muslims to the St. Louis area. To answer the question, how were Bosnian Muslims received and why were they received as such once they relocated to the St. Louis area? I spoke with the three leaders in the St. Louis community, pictured here. I held interviews with Imam Muhammad Ashik, a religious leader in the community, Ibrahim Bashovic, a business leader turned teacher for Webster University, and Patrick McCarthy, a native St. Louisan who facilitated the relocation of Bosnians to the St. Louis area. In speaking with the three leaders in the St. Louis community, it became apparent that there are four, as I have termed them, pillars of success relating to the positive relocation of Bosnian Muslims in the St. Louis area. Primarily, from my discussions with Patrick McCarthy and Ibrahim Bashovic, it became clear that nomenclature is important. Specifically, the fact that Bosnian Muslims relocated to St. Louis were labeled as refugees contributed heavily to their positive reception in the area. As both Patrick McCarthy and Ibrahim Bashovic implied, the fact that these were people who were searching for sanctuary, for a new start in the St. Louis area, eased the tensions relating to their relocation. Dr. E. Joanna Artilius of the University of Pittsburgh serves as an excellent secondary source for this first pillar of success. A sociologist, Artilius places an emphasis on the importance of nomenclature relating to American immigration policy. She notes the importance of distinctions made between the immigrant and the refugee in the United States. The second pillar of success relates to the skin color of this particular set of people. Historically, the United States has employed xenophobic and exclusionary immigration legislation, but it has also been white Americans that have typically supported and acted such legislation. According to Patrick McCarthy and Ibrahim Bashovic, the fact that Bosnian Muslims are often light of skin would seem to alleviate such racial pressures surrounding their assimilation in the United States. A third pillar of success for the relocation of Bosniaks to the St. Louis community relates to the determined intercommunal relations with different community groups in the St. Louis area. Specifically, according to Imam Hashid, a proponent of the Interfaith Partnership of St. Louis, and Ibrahim Bashovic, a teacher within the community, point to the importance of relations between groups in St. Louis. According to both of these men, whether such relations were fostered by interfaith religious outreach programs, or were facilitated by the International Institute of St. Louis, or by a local staple in the community such as Fatman University, which established the Bosnian Memory Project, the presence of intercommunal or between group relations has fostered a peaceful relocation of Bosnians in the St. Louis area. An important secondary source that I have discussed in class over the course of my 4 years here is Ashutosh Varshney's Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, Hindus and Muslims in India. In this work, Varshney points out the deep history of violence between Hindus and Muslims in India and says that it may be alleviated by the presence of intercommunal relations between the two groups. This theory, which promotes the importance of active focus and determined proximity of relations between groups, can be applied to the St. Louis community as well. And it alleviated tensions between groups fostered by the peaceful relocation of Bosnians in St. Louis. And then the final point of my pillar of success, the kind of determination, contributing to the successful relocation of Bosnian Muslim refugees to St. Louis, ties in well with the intercommunal relations pillar. As all three of my interviewees pointed out, a deep cultural history of Bosnians contributed heavily to the willingness of Bosnian Muslim refugees to reach out within the St. Louis community. According to all three men, Bosnians have a deep cultural history marked by social outreach. Bosnians are not people who seclude themselves from the outside world. They open businesses, they socialize, and as such, they have been open to working within the St. Louis community, fostering the intercommunal relations which are ever so important to the positive relocation of Bosniaks to St. Louis. And in conclusion, I point to one of the more famous sonnets in American history. On the Statue of Liberty is the sonnet, The New Colossus Transcribed. A cornerstone of the mythology of the United States of America, the New Colossus reads, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." Is this sonnet simply a myth, or instead does it serve as a goal for the U.S. to strive for? In such divisive times, can the United States live up to the new Colossus? After an analysis of the relocation of Bosnian Muslims to St. Louis, it would seem apparent that St. Louis may in fact serve as a light guiding those in need. Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Carley Goodman, and my presentation and traditional research project discuss the Black press's tainted coverage of racism from the years 1941 to 1945. My interest in this research stemmed from the interest in a side of U.S. history that I never got a chance to learn about prior to taking classes here at this university, and I was able to narrow down many topics into a discussion of the Black press and its coverage of racism. My research question is, was the Black press's coverage of racism, not only against Black Americans, but also Japanese Americans, tainted by outside pressures during World War II? The two main primary sources and documents I used for this research were the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. These papers were of a small percentage of African American newspapers that covered Japanese internment, other than West Coast papers. The picture on the left is the street view of the Chicago Defender, and on the right, the Pittsburgh Courier. The very first Black newspaper to appear in the United States was the Freedom's Journal in 1763. This being the first Black newspaper in the United States was dangerous for all those who were involved. The issues the paper was covering, which were slavery and abolition, created a huge uproar. As time went on, the Black press gained more readers and more newspapers. By the 19th century, the Black press began to grow and transition into something much larger and more influential. The Black press, prior to World War II, began to accumulate readers from the Black community, as well as to gain coverage and attention from the white press and government. Society had begun to move into more urbanized settings, and the Black press was able to shift and focus from a literate elite to a mass appeal. It began to cover debates and approach front-page news, such as crime, discrimination, and incidents of racism. The Black press had a huge influence on Black communities all over the country. It not only brought many controversial issues to light, but it also united Black communities. The Black press was also a huge eye-opener to the white press and white community. Once the Black press began to cover more ground, they fell under the watchful eye of the government. They were already at what seemed like war with white supremacist groups, and now the government was unhappy with what they were covering. These white supremacist groups had been targeting the Black press since they had originated, but it had grown more violent as the Black press began to gain more ground. There were death threats as well as threats of burning down homes and businesses, and at the time, J. Edgar Hoover was in charge of the FBI. He held an enormous amount of power and was sometimes controlled by the highest reaches of government. Hoover pushed for the sedation of the Black press during World War II due to the rumors that communists and Japanese were trying to recruit Black support. The FBI tried to suppress the increased criticism of discrimination by accusing the Black press of violating the Espionage Act. The fear of government interference caused the Black press to continue to voice its support for the war. As the United States entered the war, the draft fell into place, and men from all over the country were leaving for training and being shipped abroad. The draft was unkind to all, and even more so for minorities. Black American men were being drafted into an army that was still segregated, and still followed Jim Crow laws. Before the United States had entered World War II, they were already fighting a war on the home front, a war on racism. Because the black press was under the watchful eye of the government, it still had to sell its readers the idea that despite their injustices, they must fight and support the war. In order for the black press to support the war and fight against racism, the Pittsburgh Courier came up with a double V campaign, Victory at Home and Victory Abroad. It was a fight against racism and fascism. It was stated in the Amsterdam News on an African American newspaper that if we stand back and let the white man fight this war, then it will be the white man's country, and he will have the right to do as he pleases. The black community supported the war because of the fear of never gaining true equality. Throughout the Second World War, very few newspapers covered the nationally racialized problems of America's war on the home front. The Chicago Defender chose to cover issues of racism that were being swept under the rug, including Japanese internment. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor and after President Roosevelt authorized Executive Order 9066, which forced the internment of Japanese Americans. On the left is a picture of the notice for all persons of Japanese ancestry. It's a notice for relocation. And on the right is a Japanese salesman with his child putting up a sign for an evacuation sale. When it came to coverage of internment, even journalists from the same newspaper had different opinions. S.I. Hayakawa, professor of semantics at the Illinois Institute of Technology, one of the Defender's columnists, and a Japanese American, offered an opinion on the mighty and not so mighty that resulted in the internment. When minorities, whether Negroes or Jews or Mexicans or Pacific Coast Japanese Americans or anybody else, are discriminated against, they are victims of the 2-year-old mentalities in the majority culture. Haven't we, who are members of the minorities, got troubles enough without making even more trouble for ourselves for acting like 2-year-olds toward each other? Another columnist for the Defender, John Robert Badger, discussed the making of un-Americans. After taking a look at Japanese culture and history, he finds Japanese Americans demonstrably disloyal. These opposing views left readers on opposite sides of the fight for equality. Early on in 1942, after the internment of Japanese Americans, the black press seemed to show no sympathy for Japanese Americans. For example, prior to Japanese internment, there was an area in Los Angeles called Little Tokyo. This was an entire neighborhood and area of the city that housed Japanese Americans. Once the internment was enforced, the entire area was evacuated and left for available housing. Black papers such as the California Eagle reported on these available opportunities for black Americans already living in the city or migrating to the city. As internment was nearing an end for some Japanese Americans in 1944, the attitude had changed. The black press, as well as black society, were able to relate to Japanese Americans. The Defender covered an incident in 1944 in Chicago, where the Illinois Central Railroad hired 59 Japanese Americans. And white workers threatened that they would strike unless the Japs were removed. The Japanese were dismissed from their jobs, and Frank Noakes, the general chairman, said that it was not a racial issue. The Defender goes on to discuss how the German workers were not under question like the Japanese workers, and how black Americans who have also endured segregation and discrimination sympathize with Japanese Americans. The picture here is a cartoon from September of 1945 in the Chicago Defender. This was released just 5 days after the Japanese troops had surrendered. The details expose the irony of a racist America. The black soldiers walk out of a separate entryway marked for colored. These soldiers have just arrived home after fighting a war against racism, or fascism, only to return to a racist America. Heading a parallel procession of white soldiers, a black soldier pats a Japanese civilian who's dirty and wearing rags on the shoulder and says, "I know just how you're going to feel, bub." This is perhaps the black press acknowledging the racism and prejudices that had rained down on Japanese Americans post-Pearl Harbor that would continue on after the war was over. The Defender was expressing its sympathy and that the issues that black Americans and Japanese Americans had in common. To conclude, the black press covered incidents of racism inconsistently between the years 1941 and 1945. Outside pressures, such as the fear of government repression, the fear of never gaining equality, and having to prove loyalty to the United States, caused the black press to unevenly cover racism during World War II. Because of these outside pressures, it was difficult for the black press to support the war, prove their patriotism, and take a consistent stance against the internment of Japanese Americans.
Do I need a microphone? Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Good evening, my fellow historians. First of all, my name is Ada Chung, and tonight I'll be presenting on my research project, Understanding Tuberculosis in Children at Haganose Castle from 1922 to 1959. So let's start off, it's also a non-traditional research project. Let's start off with my question. My research question is, what is the rationale for the creation of a children's TB sanitarium during the early 20th century, and what was the experience of these children at Haganose Castle? Before we unpack my question, I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of reasoning and purpose into why I chose this as my topic. So first of all, TB is one of the oldest and deadliest infectious diseases, and it's still a relevant disease that affects approximately 10.4 million people worldwide today. Research in children tuberculosis during this time was severely lacking due to difficulties in diagnosis and non-specific symptoms. Additionally, TB is very personal to me because someone very dear to me passed away from the disease a couple years ago, so hence my research in it. So many of you might be wondering, what exactly is tuberculosis? So let me give you a little breakdown. So TB is a contagious disease caused by the bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Like the common cold, it's very easy to spread through the air. People who are ill with pulmonary TB or TB of the lungs, which is the site most commonly affected, are often infectious and can easily spread the disease by coughing, sneezing, or even simply talking with someone in a close distance. So although it primarily infects the lungs, it can infect any part of the body. So although those who breathe in the bacteria and have become infected with the disease may not necessarily become sick, depending on if you have an active or latent form of tuberculosis. Currently, about 1/3 of the world's population is infected by the bacteria that leads to tuberculosis. Generally, 5 to 10% of those infected will become sick or infectious. So let me give you a little bit of some context to TB in Wales. So TB in Wales was a major health problem. Stats in 1910 show that 7 out of the 15 worst affected counties in Wales and England were in Wales. Additionally, the top 5 counties suffering from the highest death rates due to TB were Welsh. It's cited that social conditions, such as diet and poor housing, was the main cause for higher TB mortality rates in the nation. So because this was such a big problem, this led to the establishment of the King Edward VII Welsh National Memorial Association in 1911. So this association was designed with 4 main purposes, and these purposes are to provide dispensaries for medicines to be used for treatment, provide a research facility to the School of Medicine, manage sanatoria for treatment, and finally to fund educational skills and talks and increase public awareness in the prevention of the disease. So what about TB in children? These were the only very few sources that I found that was remotely related that specifically targeted TB in children during this time period. So in Kelly Neck's article, he discusses how certain families and individuals are predisposed to tuberculosis. It's stressed that although eradication is necessary and extremely important, it should not be forgotten that children who are more susceptible should obviously be protected through special preventive measures. In Broadbent's article, he states that although the disease in adults had been decreasing significantly over the last 30 years, the same could not be said about TB in children. In fact, rates of TB in children have distinctly increased during this time period. And finally, Dr. James Kerr, the Educational Committee. He, in his report, he states that the importance of helping the tuberculous child. He believed that each child was worth protecting from the deadly disease, just as much as an adult patient would be. So here's a brief history of Craignos Castle. So Adelina Petty, she's an Italian opera singer who bought the castle from a local landowner who built the castle. And later she expanded the grounds to a total of 48 acres. Following her death in 1919, her husband Baron Olaf Rudolf Söderström sold the entire estate to the King Edward VII Welsh National Memorial Association, which they later transformed into the Tuberculosis Sanatorium. So here is a list of treatments that was performed at Craignos Castle. I'll be focusing on the last three specifically. So absolute rest treatment. So those with bones and joint tuberculosis had their affected limbs immobilized in splints or plaster casts. It's believed that by resting these parts, it would promote natural healing. So this treatment included lying in a cast molded to your body for about 3 months or more. Sounds quite unpleasant, doesn't it? So the goal was that through immobilization, symptoms would be eased and damaged tissues would be healed. Next is collapse therapy, or also known as artificial pneumothorax. So this method was based on the idea that by collapsing and resting the lung, TB lesions would have a greater chance at healing. So this technique involved injecting air through a hollow needle in the gap between your lung and your chest wall. So this procedure needed to be repeated several times in order for it to be effective. So however, collapse therapy, if it was not executed properly, a partial collapse of a lung or paralyzing of half the diaphragm could occur. Finally, there's also gastric leverage. So this technique was developed to search for TB bacteria in children with the pulmonary infection. So most children were unable to cough up phlegm from their own lungs, so instead they just swallowed it. So the staff would try to retrieve this by washing out the stomach with some warm water, and then they poured this warm water through a funnel on the end of a rubber tube. So this tube would be pushed down your throat, and after they retrieve the stomach juices, they would later then inject it into specially bred guinea pigs, which would then react to the presence or absence of the germs. So French doctors claimed that this procedure caused very little inconvenience to the children. However, many patients would argue otherwise. Right? So Roar Harry, he remembers how uncomfortable it was to have a tube pushed down his throat. It will cause him into a panic. He sobbed and begged for the staff to stop, but ultimately the nurse had to force him to sit still, and the tube was shoved down his throat. So I kind of want to go over some more personal accounts. Here's Squadala Evans. She's the girl on the right, and this is her brother. This picture was taken about the time she was admitted to the sanatorium in 1931, and she was 10 years old. She was admitted for a tubercular abscess on her right jaw. She had to undergo surgery to scrape the jawbone, followed by sun ray lamp treatment. She recalls how frightened she was because the post-operative treatment required that the scab on her jaw be torn away, and then heat would be applied directly. She had to endure this every day for her entire stay of 16 weeks at the castle. Additionally, during her time at the sanatorium, she recalls how if someone was being disciplined, by the staff, it would, all the children would nickname it Squash, and this happened quite often. So she remembers a girl named Madge who wrote a poem about the Squash scolding. Squash, 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 here comes staff nurse to squash us. Squash, 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 that's all we're getting here. The nurses and the sisters, their tongues must be in blisters. That's all we get at Craignos is squash, squash, squash. Here's another account. His name is Roger Bainin. He was admitted in 1949 and was immediately assigned bed rest as treatment. He developed TB as a toddler when he fell down, and his right knee, became infected. So he was bedbound during most of his stay for 5 years at Craignos Castle. he was almost completely unaware of other children, except for one other boy named Graham Canning. Most of his time was spent on the balcony where his bed was located, and he would be on the balcony despite the weather, whether the conditions would be very cold or very hot. To him, bed rest at Krakenos taught him how to be independent. He states that I was independent in a way that I think anybody who has been institutionalized for a while would be. So, finally, my conclusion. It was necessary to create a sanatorium that specifically targeted children because, one, there was like not enough research for TB in children at the time, and additionally, the symptoms were hard to diagnose. Was there significant improvement? Unfortunately, I was unable to find concrete stats and evidence about this because there was a stigma that surrounded those who contracted TB. Even those who were cured, you did not want to tell this to other people just in case you wouldn't get hired for a job or just because you didn't want to be outcasted by your community. So, additionally, the experience for children patients at Krakenos Castle, I think they displayed tremendous courage and resilience. Patients clearly had a difficult time, in my opinion, and just their courage and just how they handled the whole situation as a child, I think, was absolutely amazing. So I have an embroidered tapestry that I created for my non-traditional research project. This features a reference to the sanatorium. Thank you, my fellow senior Semites who is holding it up. It's a little hard to see, it's kind of dark, but as a costume seamstress, I wanted to create an interdisciplinary project where I combined my two loves of TV and sewing. So, thanks guys. So, I embroidered this entire thing. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a big shadow and there's the body organs that could be infected with TB. And there's a little girl next to the shadow, but yeah. So that is my project. I just wanted to illuminate what children at the council might have felt during this time, because often their voices are silenced as a child. So through this, I intend to visually realize the emotions and the history of the children at Krakenos. And then finally, some special things. Thank you all for coming, listening to my presentation. I really appreciate it. And yeah, so thank you so much.
Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Trisha. I did a traditional research project this semester, and my topic is the decline of the university in late 17th century England. When we were talking about the university in the early modern England, it means Oxford and Cambridge. They were the only two universities in 17th century England. These two universities both experienced a numerical decline in their student bodies after 1660. So my research project aims to explain the causes of this decline. From 1642 to 51, England experienced a civil war, which led to the execution of the King Charles I and the exile of his son Charles. They're not very creative by their son's name. England was therefore a republic from 49 to 60. And in 1660, Charles II was invited back to England and restored the monarchy. So his reign was, which lasted from 1660 to 85, was often referred to as the Restoration period. Two changes that took place during the Restoration period were closely related to the higher education. The first is the Act of Uniformity in 1662. This act called for an unconditional conformation to the state church, the Church of England. The term dissenters is generally applied to all Protestants who did not conform to the doctrine of the established Church of England. The legislation stipulated that the dissenters would be expelled from the established church and also the university. The economic growth in the Restoration period was another context that we need to know. The government encouraged export and foreign trade through legislation and gave more protection to home production through legislation, and there was therefore a rising volume of employment of farmers, manufacturers, merchants, and ship owners, which proved the prosperity in commerce in the Restoration period. The political change and economic change in England inevitably were reflected in the educational scene. So at Oxford and Cambridge from 1550s to 1650s, there was an expansion period. The annual first-year admission at Oxford, it rose from 124 to 455. The absolute peak occurred in the 1630s. Total first-year admission at Oxford and Cambridge was more than 1,000. But after the 1660, the first-year admission consistently shrank, and the total admission of Oxford and Cambridge by the end of that century had dropped to around 510. The university generally consisted of two classes, gentlemen and plebeian. These two classes, they have different purpose to go to university. For the gentleman group, they were seeking the experience of classical education. First, obtaining a degree was less important for them. But for the plebeian students, they came to university to take a degree, and most of them would become clergymen after they graduate. But both the population of gentlemen and plebeians experienced a decline after 1660. But the bulk of decline appeared among the plebeian population. Here at Oxford, plebeian population dropped from 156 to 98 in 1686. And at Cambridge, we see the same pattern of decline. The curriculum at a university in the late 17th century was a combination of scholastic philosophy and classical studies. Students were supposed to learn this subject through reading and memorizing the ancient Greek and Roman texts. So here is a selection from a 17th century study guide. We can see that the most reading the student did was about Latin and Greek, and they also wrote in Latin and Greek. And most of the author, they are ancient dead people. And also the Holy Scripture is the most important text they read. The curriculum at Oxford and Cambridge was highly conservative and haven't been changed for so many years. It was dominated by medieval scholastic philosophy, and the majority of the readings were ancient Roman and Greek texts. The gentlemen who were seeking a proper liberal arts education, they started to feel disappointed about the outdated education in the university. Edward Gibbon was a famous historian, and he commented his study at Oxford was the most idle and unprofitable of my whole life. the primitive discipline was adapted to the education of priests and monks, and the government still remains in the hand of the clergy and all of men whose manners are remote from the prison world and whose eyes are dazzled by the light of philosophy. Another factor that contributes to the decline of university is the founding of the dissenting academies. Due to the edge of conformity, a religious test is required for being awarded a degree at Oxford and Cambridge, and dissenters were forbidden to teach in the established schools and university, and they were expelled from the university. So the dissenting scholars and students, they want to seek education, they must seek education elsewhere, and so they founded their own higher education institution according to their own understanding of liberal arts education. Because unlike the university whose curriculum and teaching were controlled by the state church, Dissenting Academy did have more freedom in their teachings and curriculum. And Dr. Joseph Priestley, he was the discoverer of oxygen, and he was also a dissenting scholar. And he believed that the liberal arts education in the Dissenting Academy was more liberal than the university, which would make it finally surpass Oxford and Cambridge. And over 40 dissenting academies were founded after the Restoration. The subjects they taught in the Dissenting Academy was not only traditional Greek and Latin, they also taught modern languages, mathematics, and a certain amount of natural science, principally physics. And also we can see here is a record from Warrington Academy. It shows that 1/4 of the students chose to study commerce in their academy, which this course was of course not offered by the traditional and conservative Oxford and Cambridge. The main factor that discouraged plebeian students from attending university is the economy concern, because the cost of university education was rise very quickly in the 17th century. In the early 17th century, it cost only £20, and by the end of the century, it reached £50. Unfortunately, we are facing the same situation today. Well, it's interesting that I received a form from Oxford today, and they want me to sign it, and of course I read it. And it says that I am responsible for knowing that the cost of my master course will cost me £35,000. So the world did change a lot in 300 years. And since the main motivation for plebeian students to attend university was looking forward to becoming a clergy, so the job prospects of clergymen was always important for them to considering whether they should attend the university. The job prospects of clergymen was quite disappointed in the late 17th century. The income of clergymen was disappointing. They earned about £45 a year, and the job market for them was shrinking. There was about 327 vacancies would occur a year, but the newly graduated student with degree that Oxford and Cambridge generated every year was over 400. And also the advancement within the Holy Order was quite limited because the higher position was mostly occupied by the sons of gentlemen and also the sons of the eminent clergymen. Compared to the job in the church, doing business seems to promise a better future for the plebeian family. If we compare here, like the merchants and traders, they can earn way more than what clergymen can learn. So it was less likely for the plebeian family to invest a lot on university education, while the outcome was relatively poor. So here we have a conclusion. The negative attitude toward university education among gentlemen was the main factor for them to starting to abandon the university, and also the development of dissenting academies distracted a substantial amount of students, and the common concerns of the plebeian class discouraged them from attending the university. So all these factors contributed to the decline in enrollment in the university during the Restoration. Thank you. You have 8 minutes intermission.
All right, okay.
This is planned, guys.
Wendy?
So if you wonder about the French press, this is the full college students' version of the teacup. So hi, good evening everyone. My name is Nee, and I thank you for attending to my non-traditional history research presentation entitled Reading the Tea Leaves, Tea Production in Long Dong Province, Vietnam. So I have to mention that I am an art and design student, and I used my skill to work on an interdisciplinary project that traced the rich history of tea in my hometown region, Long Dong. I started with a research question: how Long Dong Province became known for tea production during the last century. I wonder how the history of tea production in Long Dong is related to his current position in both domestic and international markets. With this project, well, that's not here, I wanted to contribute to the scant agriculture literature, particularly in tea sector in Vietnam. As such, I'm dedicating my paper to my parents who gave me the childhood on the plantations, and to Lutzi, who kindly accepted me in the senior seminar. Tea in Vietnam is a long-held tradition, as my mother would firmly tell. I conducted an interview with a local farmer in Bảo Lộc, Lâm Đồng, where I'm from, as one of the first steps in my research journey. And I asked him a very simple question. I asked him, how long have we known how to drink tea? When a Vietnamese person talk about tea, what's the first thing that we think about? And he said, well, we knew of tea for a long time. And talking about the meaning of tea, a Vietnamese person would associate it with socializing rituals. What this means is that when we come into somebody's house, and an act of offering tea is an act of welcome, and then it builds upon conversation, and it ties it all together. That's partially the reason why I wanted to do this project. And also, the unclear indication of the time when people in my hometown started to produce tea fueled me to research further and understand the history of tea making in the region. And then, so my paper complements a historical review of tea production in the region and supplement with a key informant interview and follow-ups with a local Vietnamese farmer. And I examined numerous primary and secondary sources dated back from the 1920s. I used many sources from the Special Asia collection at Cornell University and also here at I will. And those are the pictures. Through the in-depth search for the true history of tea production in Long Dong, I discovered the deeply rooted tea culture in Vietnam. It is evident through the everyday routines and ancestral occupation passing down from generation to generation, further than I ever imagined. Although this seems to be changing with the ever-increasing and pervasive force of globalization. Well, shall we travel to the other side of the globe, to Vietnam, towards the past? As you can see, the circle regions designated for tea growing in 1953 are significantly more than in 2009, where the orange indicates on the map on the right. But Lộc will stand the test of time and continue to embark in its prosper and tea growing sector, while other regions transitions into agricultural sectors such as fruit production, shown in green. So allow me to tell you a story behind such difference, the story of Balok tea, starting with a notion. The highlands, where Balok is indicated with the red circle, was considered uninhabitable for people. However, all of the preferred climate and elevation preconditions for tea are found in London, attracting the Frenchmen to establish various plantations in Annam, which was at the time under the French administration. The mass production of tea first started in Tonkin and Annam, which was organized, facilitated, and chiefly financed by the French government in the 1920s, as wild tea trees could be found within the northern highlands of Vietnam to southern plateaus. Tea was harvested then by the Aboriginals and brought to Lum, which is in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, present day, to be processed with Chinese technique and sold under the false impression that it was Chinese tea. This was the rough start to the region's tea production, where labor and local farmers went unrecognized under the colonial rules. The next major historical event took place in 1954 as a result of Geneva Accords. 1 year after that map happened, 850,000 Vietnamese citizens moved south under the reign of Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Dinh, and the French military forces withdrawn from Tonkin down to Annam, and then afterwards they withdraw completely out of the country. In the plateau region, there was an explosion of additional residential and commercial settlements, and then many of the immigrants choose Balok to call home, and one of them being my grandmother. At first, due to lack of management and difficulties in finding and sorting tea, they grew a mixture of different tea types without understanding where they came from, and most of them came. They also inherited techniques and researches left over by the Frenchmen. And then so many years after, in 1986, the Communist Party instituted many drastic reforms, known as the Mới, or the renovation. These open-door policies allow for additional foreign investors to flock into Vietnam to pursue commerce. Taiwanese tea makers invested in both northern and southern Vietnam, bringing into the country new tea types and superior oolong tea processing techniques, and this has most success in Nam Dong, even though they invested in both the north and the south. And then so an interview with local Vietnamese farmer who has worked with Taiwanese investor in the past showed that before 1994 we grew all kind of tea, and then after 1994 they all tea types being used were left by the Frenchmen, enterprises and research facilities. However, after we started to produce oolong tea cheaply, and that's the tea that I know today. Contemporary Vietnamese tea producers now use a mixture of fertilizers, both organic and chemically augmented, to maintain the quality of tea scents, an outdated practice that was used by the Frenchmen at first. And as the quality of the final products really dictated the decision makers to buy inorganic fertilizers, non-organic fertilizer, or chemically augmented pesticides that goes back from the current trend that we are moving towards organic products instead. So that's problem number one that they have currently. Problem number two was a report by Asian Development Bank on proposed loan to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam for the tea and fruit development project in 2000 encompasses the local distribution of educational material, particularly in training, books and documents and research institutions and libraries in major agricultural regions, as shown earlier in the map in 2009. Their rationale was that to enhance the current state of Balok Tea Research Center. The report mentioned that little research was done due to lack of equipment. In 2006, they said that there was a few handbooks and a few training was available to farmers, but in 2009, when the loans was completed, the report showed no significant increase on the number of research equipment, books, or unknown research budget from the bank allocated for research purposes. And then that marks the end of my paper. So I pondered, how can we improve the current state of tea production in my hometown? And that's so I came up with this ideal solution, and that to create this imaginative tea association, and that significantly understood the rich history behind the tea production and the many influences on its greater narrative of Vietnamese tea making. And then so I started with making a mark for this, or a logo mark or logotype for this association. So the company design project focused on its creative attention on the brand identity for said association, using brand identity as marketing strategy in promoting good tea production in London to domestic and international consumers, in both ways to preserve said history and to grow the locally owned tea sector in the future. And then moreover, the association I imagined was also tackle the many inherent environmental and economic problems through calls for additional research and education pursuits, tackling each obstacles towards a sustainable practice and global consuming trend using organic products, recognizing the conditions have been part of the rapid entry of Vietnam into the global world capitalist system. And then so originally, in order to, this is the profession of the mark. That is how I made it. Originally, in order to tie the mark to its historical background, the typographic choice in the historical booklet, right here, was inspired by the modern French typography, and the family type was called Cochin, which is a certain part of Vietnam under the French administration. If you catch me soon enough, this one copy is yours. The pictorial mark was made based on the landscape of Dumfries. Secondly, the mark was read from a tea leaf. And then so as you see all of the line that goes across the tea leaf, it signifies the landscape. And then so overall, it encompasses the history, the mission, and the uniqueness of tea production in Bac Lộc, which is striving to maintain its highest standards of production, including sustainable practices regarding the three important sustainable principles of the age of globalization, which is people, planet, and profit. And then so I thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments after the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Pasadzi. This semester, I chose to take a traditional approach to my research, which focused on the debates regarding British sovereignty over the American colonies within Great Britain from the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 to the start of the American Revolution in 1776. So, when I was researching for possible topics, I came across an article written on British sovereignty by a British author over the American colonies. And I had been previously taught the colonist point of view of the conflict, in which the colonists were against taxation without representation. However, this was not the case in the British debates, and the right to taxation was largely based on, did Great Britain have sovereignty over its American colonies? So my research question was, what were the debates on sovereignty in Great Britain from 1763 to 1776? Some related questions that I focused on in my research and paper were, who were the major proponents during this debate, and what arguments did they use? I found that most historiographies focused on taxation and not sovereignty. However, taxation and sovereignty are connected to some extent, and the members of Parliament during this time recognized this. So my research takes a more in-depth look into the specific debates within Parliament by analyzing the records of the sessions of Parliament. And in addition, my research aims to show that by 1766, the opinions of the vast majority of members of the House of Commons had become concrete and would not change through 1776. So before we get into the debates, it's important to look at two primary consequences of the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763 as part of the 7 Years' War. So Great Britain won the war, and due to this they gained a ton of new territory west of the Appalachian Mountains from France, which meant that they needed a bigger army to protect this newly acquired territory, which meant that more money had to be spent. However, a massive national debt was obtained from this war, and they had to be very careful with where their expenses went. So imagine you're a member of Parliament in 1763, and you know that the national debt had more than doubled from £72 million in 1754 to £146 million in 1763. So the national debt is at an all-time high, and you need additional revenue. So you're looking through the empire for places that aren't taxed as much, and you find that the average citizen in Great Britain paid 26 shillings per year in taxes, and the average citizen in the American colonies only paid 1 shilling. So it was clear that the American colonies were the best bet for an additional source of revenue. However, they had been largely ignored for the past 100 years. So some members of Parliament were unsure what limit of sovereignty that they had over the American colonies. So in 1764, Parliament tried to assert its sovereignty over the American colonies through several taxes on sugar, silks, wine, and other commodities. The following year, in 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which placed a tax on legal documents, newspapers, and pamphlets. However, the colonial assemblies began to petition these newly issued taxes, and Parliament did not want to upset the colonies any further, and it was decided that the taxes should be repealed. However, Parliament still needed to maintain its sovereignty over the American colonies in some form. So, with the repealment of the Stamp Act and these taxes, they passed the Declaratory Act, which stated Parliament had supreme authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So I found in my research that there is 3 perspectives that took shape on how Great Britain viewed sovereignty of its American colonies. The first group was the supporters of total sovereignty. The second was the supporters that felt there was a middle ground that could be reached where Great Britain still retained its sovereignty over the American colonies. And the final group, who was not as large as these two, supported American independence. So on the left is George Grenville, who was a past Prime Minister of Great Britain and one of the most vocal supporters of total sovereignty. And on the right is Edmund Burke, who would become sort of the leader of the supporters of the middle ground in the early 1770s. So the supporters of total sovereignty felt that they virtually represented all citizens within the empire. So even though those citizens may not be directly represented in Parliament, they felt that when they voted, that their votes were based on the best interests of everyone within the empire. However, the supporters of the middle ground felt that the lack of representation of the colonies in Parliament meant that they could not be taxed. The supporters of total sovereignty felt that there needed to be one supreme legislature. So in cases where there was disputes between the local legislatures, there needed to be one supreme legislature that could sort of rule over those local ones. The supporters of the middle ground, however, felt that the colonial legislatures had become legitimate and that the past precedent had been set from the past 100 years that gave them their legitimacy. Throughout these debates, both sides cited past examples for and against total sovereignty. In particular, one of the major past examples that both sides used were when the counties of Chester and Durham had been taxed by Parliament. They were unrepresented in Parliament at that time, and the supporters of total sovereignty used this example as there didn't need to be direct representation. However, the supporters of the middle ground quickly argued that that Parliament that had taxed those specific counties had recognized that they had recognized the lack of representation in Parliament and quickly resolved that issue. And then finally, the supporters of total sovereignty felt that it was their sovereign right of total taxation. They cited specific examples of how the colonial charters didn't have the right of taxation in them, and because of this, taxation fell within their rights. The supporters of the middle ground, on the other hand, felt that during the past 100 years, there had become a distinction between external taxes, which were taxes on trade between the colonies and Great Britain, and internal taxes, which were the taxes that were voted upon by colonial legislatures, specifically within the American colonies. And then the third group were the supporters of American independence. They reiterated some of the same arguments as the supporters of the middle ground, but they thought that America was already independent. They argued that they had their own law enforcement, legislatures, and methods of internal taxation. They talked about how they contributed a vast amount of troops during the war and proved that they were self-sustaining. They also argued that the economic benefit from trade with the American colonies would still remain, but that the political conflict within the political sphere of Great Britain and between Great Britain and the American colonies would end. In addition, it would reduce the economic burden on the crown. So if the colonies were independent, they wouldn't have to pay for any of the troops over there, and the American colonies would be forced to fend for themselves. So to conclude, why total sovereignty prevailed, there are 5 reasons. So during this entire discussion, it was intensified by the ongoing crisis. Like I mentioned before, the national debt had reached an all-time high, and it was evident that there needed to be new sources of revenue. Second, the military presence during the war and during this time period was a sign of sovereignty. Third, 1/3 of the colonists within the colonies desired to be a part of the British Empire, and the supporters of total sovereignty felt that this was a good enough reason to assert their sovereignty. Fourth, there was a lack of precedents that favored total sovereignty. So like I said before, both sides were citing these past examples, and they both reached logical conclusions from them, but they were total opposite conclusions. And then finally, the unwillingness of Great Britain and the American colonies to compromise concerning direct representation would continue throughout this period, and then it would result in the American Revolution. So like I said before, these arguments and sort of these arguments would become concrete by 1766, and following that, you can see that through the expressions of total sovereignty by the Acts of Parliament. So the last effort of Parliament to tax the colonists was the Tea Act of 1773. It showed Parliament's unwillingness to give up their supreme right of taxation, which was derived from its sovereignty, and the following acts passed by Parliament were concerned with enforcing these taxes through force. Parliament would send troops, revoke charters, and command colonial legislatures to comply with their wishes. Thank you.
Buenas tardes todos. My name is Troy Fuentes, and I will be presenting my research topic on corridos, music as an instrument in the 1910 Mexican Revolution. I'm part of the senior seminar group that decided to do a non-traditional approach to this project. I have crafted a graphic novella in which you will see some of the pictures from it in these slides. So, my research question is, what were the revolutionary qualities of corridos during the Porfirian era, which ranged from 1867 to 1910, that led to the Mexican Revolution of 1910? First of all, I became interested in this topic at a very young age. My parents and grandparents listened to corridos all the time, and me being the little person in the room wanting to know what was up, asked, "Hey, what do these mean?" To which I got a reply of, "Don't worry, you don't understand them, so don't worry about it." Oh, how the tables have turned now. All right. So, before we delve into the corridos, it is important to very briefly discuss three revolutionaries and their goals during the Porfirian government that were extremely important for corridos to be made. First of all, we have on one side the revolutionary, and on the other side is going to be the version in my graphic novella. To begin to introduce the person, this is Emiliano Zapata. He was drafted into the government army during 1910, and it was there that he began to sympathize with many of the peasants of the Porfirian government as the government took away their lands, like very unfairly. Because of this, he founded the Zapatistas and acted out against the government for land reform. Then we have Francisco Madero. He was a rich landowner that had opposed Porfirio, and in the 1910 elections, he was actually going to beat him in the elections. The only problem is Porfirio Diaz is kind of a baby, and he doesn't like losing, so he got locked up. And detained before he could get to the election, and as a result, Porfirio won. He later escaped to Texas, where he called for revolution. He called for the peasants to uprise and revolution against Porfirio. This was known as El Plan de San Luis de Potosí. And then finally, we get to Pancho Villa. Sorry. Oh, yes, here we go. Okay, so Pancho Villa was a wanted bandit that joined with Madero against Diaz and Zapata as well. He was a very experienced in battle, and drove Diaz out of office in 1911 with the Battle of Ciudad Juarez. He was a prominent general, and he often used peasants as a military force due to their willingness to fight for their land, no matter what the cost. And there he is. The smug bandit he was. Oh, and then finally, we get to Porfirio Diaz himself, the dictator of Mexico at the time. He came to power by force in 1876 after he disliked the presidency of Lerdo de Tejeda in 1876. Under his rule, more of his iron grip really, Mexico had seen years of great industrialization and modernity. Sadly, this new modernity was only good for the elite, as peasants could not enjoy any of it because they could either not pay for it or they were just, ousted out by them. This was especially true once he began selling the lands of the campesinos, or the peasants, to the rich. He became known as the traitor of Mexico because he sold off his lands to foreigners. Now then, a campesino is a Mexican peasant that usually couldn't read, write, and had very little power. And a corrido is a Mexican ballad that a corrido is a Mexican ballad. Corridos originate since the 1700s when the Spanish conquered the Mexican Indians, and the corridos are used to represent the struggle and voice of these lowly and repressed peasants. A more important use of a corrido is that it helped relay the events occurring in Mexico and other parts to other people in other parts of Mexico as oral history. The thing about these oral history corridos was that they were really accessible by the masses, and some of these common themes of these corridos included, double meanings, jokes, or even familiar terms like familiar words of a song. Like, have you ever heard of the cucaracha, for example? It has a lot of variations of it. Some of them looking dirty. Alright? So on this side, on one side, we see a musician campesino, along with my main character in my novella, Mateo Menes. Now then, in corridos, let's go with this, the mockery of government and elites is very common. There was corridos about Diaz's mounties, which are known as rurales, the modernization of Mexico, and large estates known as haciendas. Haciendas were essentially made by taking away the land from the campesinos, and due to landlord law, essentially, to give you an example of what landlord law was, it's if you own a piece of land and you don't actually own it because you don't have the paperwork, you don't own the land. They just take it away from you. Okay, so empowering the campesino. Some corridos had elements of empowering the peasant in their lyrics. Many spoke of the campesino as the true people to rule the land because they mostly worked the land. The government had no right to dictate their interests and land holdings because they literally didn't do any of that. They worked the lands. Corridos also mentioned campesinos to be natural-born fighters that would gladly sacrifice themselves for their country. What's a bit of fighting to them, you know? Campesinos weren't afraid of death. In fact, some of them even featured death as a kind of caricature, as you see in this popular character known as the Electric Calavera in a corrido. You know, just skeletons dancing. All right. In the next slide, you will see an example of what a corrido was. I got this sound clip from a Smithsonian recording service. Normally, I would have had to pay like lots of money to get it, but you know, YouTube has it for free.
Marchemos agraristas a los campos a sembrar la semilla del progreso. Marchemos siempre unidos sin tropiezo, laborando por la paz de la nación. No queremos ya más luchas entre hermanos, olvidemos los rencores, compañeros, que se llenen de trigo los graneros y que surja la ansiada redención. Voy a empezar a cantarles la canción de la agrarista. Les dirá muchas verdades, señores capitalistas. Es el cantar de los pobres que en el campo trabajamos, los que con tantos sudores nuestra tierra cultivamos. Mucho tiempo padecimos la esclavitud del vencido, hasta que al cabo pudimos ver nuestro grupo reunido. Ay, 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 luchando por nuestro anhelo, murieron muchos hermanos, que Dios nos tenga en el cielo.
Let's stop right there. I know it's fun, let's stop right there. All right, so now glorifying the hero. This element of corridos significantly gave support to the revolutionaries as they kind of planned to, they gave support to revolutionaries as they planned to remove Porfirio Diaz from office. The corridos made for each revolutionaries were actually gave each revolutionary certain qualities like compassion, toughness, strength, and honor. If you've met Madero before you're actually hearing this corrido, you would not see him in the same light as you did before then. So, in conclusion, the role of corridos in evoking the campesinos to revolt against the Porfirian government were that they helped the revolutionaries gather tremendous support, that they also made inspiring tales about these revolutionaries. They pointed out and ridiculed governments for their faults, and finally, they swayed the masses to oppose Porfirio, so they spread the message of revolution. And now, for my graphic novella, I decided, from a graphic novella, I decided to actually do one because the ambience and the plot of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 is very rich culturally. A novella is perfect for telling a story because it doesn't really tell a story by making you forcibly to read it. Rather, you can see it through the pictures and just a little bit of text. So essentially, my graphic novella is kind of mimicking, or is really just a parallel to a corrido because I'm literally painting a picture for you.
All right, last but not least, right? Number 8. We've been talking about that number a lot. So my name's Cassie Leishman, and this semester I've spent my research on the Italian Grand Tour through the lens of British women in 1760s to 1830s. I'm also a part of the non-traditional group, so later on in this presentation you will be introduced to my fictional character that I created a 18th century diary. So to get started, I want to introduce you into my research question. So how did the social and cultural lives of women in England during the 1760s to 1830s motivate them to embark on the Grand Tour to Italy and impact their lives, or their views of the city? So first off, why Italy? Why did I become so interested in this topic? You might have seen this picture laying around campus sometimes. IES stole my photo when I studied abroad in Italy. So through that experience here at IWU, I became very in love with the culture of Italy and just specifically the city of Rome. So I really wanted to do my history research on something connected to the country. So first off, let's introduce you to what the Grand Tour was. This was a phenomenon that arose in the 16th century in Europe, but mainly in Britain. This was specifically for mainly male youth that were going on an educational trip. Their families with their means would hire a tutor typically to take them around. These could have lasted for weeks or months on end, depending on the financial backing of the family. They visited places like Italy, France, Switzerland, Turkey, Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, but ideally, Italy and France offered a plethora of educational opportunities through the arts and antiquity. So it wasn't until the 18th century, the late part of the century, that females started to have this privilege and the opportunity. Usually this came from some money they inherited from a family member that passed away, or they just were from the aristocratic background and were able to explore and embark on this grand tour to Italy. And that's what we're going to look at today. So let's go ahead and see what my findings were through my sources. So first off, we need to understand those motivations of the women and their cultural lives in England. So first off is the escape from domestic isolation. In the 18th century in England, women were confined to their home. They were seen as domestic creatures. Their role was a caretaker, a wife, a mother, and as some of the men would say, they literally swept the floor before them. So women were seen as a lesser status, and a lot of them felt trapped by this and that they weren't reaching their full potential, which is one of those big motivations. Number 2 is they wanted to enhance their educational opportunities. In the 18th century, women did not have that educational opportunity that we do have today. So fortunately, they often were self-taught, or the father would take the role of a tutor. So he would teach them how to read. Maybe she would challenge herself to learn a foreign language. They would analyze art, talk about religion, and any opportunity they had, they could debate about politics and be involved as much as they could. But basically, they were self-taught throughout their youth. Then moving into, they wanted to break free from emotional unhappiness. A lot of this was derived from the arranged marriages that they had. At the very young age of 15, British women were married off according to their parents, to a man usually of similar social status that they found relatable and compatible. We always talk about you marry your soulmate in this country, but these women did not have that opportunity. So their marriages were filled with unhappy lifestyles, and they were also trapped in the domestic isolation. And then lastly, they wanted to flee the social and cultural inequalities of England. During this time, it was the Enlightenment. There was reason coming into play. We were questioning religion, and science was on the forefront, and talk about equality was happening with the philosophers. But, however, they didn't see this in England, and they were under the preconceived notion that maybe Italy and France would offer them more of an equal opportunity in social and mobile society when they were going on this grand tour. So then they head off from Dover, England, cross the strait, and end up usually going to Venice, Florence, Rome, and Naples. And that's where we come into the views. So number one, I want to just kind of allude to the views as the first one, the escape of domestic isolation, really just encompasses the entire trip. When they went to Italy, they broke free of their home. They were enjoying and seeing the sights that they would have never had the opportunity to do in England. So that kind of closely relates is how they observed the beauty and the uniqueness of the Italian woman. So they kind of, when they strolled down the streets of Rome and they strolled through the piazzas in Italy, they saw these women, and even the servants, they realized, had pearls wrapped around their necks. There was family within the style of the Italian women, and they really enjoyed observing and seeing kind of that independence almost of the women. So that kind of connects to how they saw these women being more active in society. Then we move into the education. The arts and antiquity that was provided through the country of Italy was great, and they actually gained so much education. Many of them actually challenged themselves to actually further their own education like they did in England. They were used to self-teaching, so they pushed themselves educationally, going to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence and analyzing art, pushing themselves to become art connoisseurs, even without a guide. But oftentimes they would pay to have a cicerone or a guide, a tour guide, to walk them through the galleries like the Roman Forum and the Vatican Museum in order to learn more from these guides that were from Italy. And also they were provided opportunities they might not have known about before going. So they learned a lot more that way. Then third, raise your hand if you've been to Italy in this room at all, or anywhere that you've never been and you came upon something and you just stood there breathless. You were amazed about what you were seeing for the first time ever. Well, this is what those women wrote about. They romanticized the country because when you stand in front of the Pantheon for the first time, you feel something different. You're like, wow, what am I looking at? This masterpiece. So they really romanticized the country, which kind of connects to that emotional refuge they were searching for. They wanted to feel happiness, and they almost fell in love like they would have with their husband, but with a city because of the beauty of it in Italy. And lastly, going along with the fleeing of the social cultural inequalities, they found that Italy wasn't as equal as they thought it was going to be. That maybe life in England wasn't as bad as they thought. And so some of them were ready to return home by the end of their grand tour. So where do my sources come from? I read and analyzed letters, diaries, and journals that were written by female tourists at the time. Three main women that I really focused on were Lady Anne Riggs Miller, Hester Piazzi, and Anna Jameson. Interesting enough, who you can see on the right there, Hester Piazzi actually remarried to an Italian. So she carried an Italian last name through her last continental journey. And because of that, she felt a very close connection to the country and with the other women of the country because she carried that Italian last name. But these women really inspired me, and that is where I'm going to end my historical research part and introduce you to my creative project, which was the Diary of Molly Alford. This was something I really wanted to do because I felt as if a first-person account from a woman in 1782, based on my historical research, would add to this field. From my primary sources, I wrote about the transportation that she took to get to Italy, the food she ate, the clothing that she wore, the observations, the sites she visited, the cicerones, and maybe a little love affair in there as well. And then I also committed to writing in Old English, just as the women would have done in the 18th century. Then, from my secondary sources, I include missing pieces from those primaries, mainly itineraries, the costs and finances of the trip and how that all worked, and just filling in the gaps there. And I really wanted to, in my fictional aspect, include a little bit more self-reflection. I felt like in my research, finding educational self-reflection was difficult, so I wasn't sure, hey, did she really learn something when she walked out of that museum? She alluded and talked about it, and I know that these cicerones offered them so much education and took them to unique places, but I wanted to add to that. So lastly, I'd like to introduce you to Molly Alford really quickly. So I'm going to try and do a British accent for you. Okay. So, hello. Thanks to Cassie, I've been created. And up above you can see that my diary's been transcribed technologically. Don't really know what that means, so I'm going to actually read from the book. Okay, so as we came upon the Pantheon, I stood breathless, looking up at such a magnificent beauty in a city with so much poverty. Although it looks worn down, it is well preserved. Both Italians and tourists alike fill the piazza, basking in the Pantheon's glory. The feeling that came over me does not compare to anything thus far on my journey. Thousands of the other people have stood where I stood, looked at the exact same structure I see today. In a way, I found my purpose and a connection to the world. The beauty of the marble Corinthian columns and the rustic grandeur of the Latin engraved along the top overwhelms me with great happiness, as it is a diamond in the rough. Okay, so I'm back. It's Cassie again. Molly, I've spent too much time with her lately, so we're going to move on. But one thing I was so excited to do about this diary is the picture that you see up there is the exact same building and masterpiece that I stood in front of 2 years ago. And this feeling that I felt is exactly how the women in the 18th century felt as well, looking at that same exact thing. And the reason I chose to be a history major is because of the travel, and because you can go and see these places, and in a way you're connected to the people around the world, because centuries ago someone stood in that exact same spot. So in conclusion, because I focused on the English middle and upper class women's cultural and social lives and how these conditions impacted their view of Italy, I really found that the lack of formal education, the domestic isolation, the marriage norms, and the sex inequality really applied to how they saw and viewed the country. And in the end, I ended up creating a very unique fictional diary based upon these historical findings. And if you'd like to see it, you can see it after in the reception. So on behalf of all the graduating seniors, thank you all for joining us for the first annual History Fest.
Well, I think I speak for the whole audience here in congratulating you on really a terrific job. Before we go out to the reception, we have one other very, very special part of our program tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Michael Young and Professor Emeritus Paul Bushnell to come up here, please.
No, I have it.
She's got it here.
Here, Paul.
I think while we're handing out thanks, we ought to thank Tom for shepherding. We used to corral all of our seniors into one seminar where they had to research and write on the subject that was near and dear to the professor teaching that seminar. I think we made the right decision a few years ago to allowing students to follow their passion. Seems to work. Well, I wish we had 8 awards. Everybody here was just awesome. But we have only 2. The first one's called the Chris Berkeley Award. Chris, who you see there, was one of our students several years ago. I get choked up when I talk about him. I'm sorry, I do this every damn year. I think, well, I'm not going to do it this year. He's been dead all these years. But Chris was a highly memorable student. He was born with a congenital disease, and his doctors told him he wouldn't live past childhood, and he took great satisfaction in outliving the doctor who told him that. He went on from graduating from Wesleyan, he went on to get a master's degree in history and taught briefly till the disease caught up with him. But when he died, sorry, it's too emotional. When he died, Paul Bushnell and I and former roommates and family members, we all got together and we endow a prize in his name. We give that prize every year to the one history major graduating who not only has the quality of mind that Chris had, but who also has the passion and enthusiasm and the personality that Chris had. So as I say, tonight it appears to me we ought to divide the award in eights, one to each person, but we had to decide on one alone. The prize consists of a check, a small one, but not too small, a book, and a plaque with a certificate on it, very much like the one you see there. And this year's honoree is Mac Benitez.
Well, one of the reasons there's so much emotion attached to all of this is that Mike and I were on the phone with him in his hospital bed the very evening that he died. And it was just a tremendous experience. This guy's love of history, where it came from, we never knew, but it took charge of his life, and it made it all sensible, in a sense, in the end. That he lived for it, and he did it. And he published interesting book reviews. And I read a little bit of one of them this afternoon, just to remind myself. Thanks, Mike. Mike fortunately kept the examples of this. And Chris, really, in our minds, is the sort of student that we probably wished at some point we were, whether we were or not. And I think we live it out in different ways. And but it's a very honorable and enthusiastic discovery of the life of Chris. He was an exception. And none of us could do exactly what he did. But what we can do is memorialize him as this act does. It's a good place to start.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
It's you? I don't have anything to say.
Okay. What I want to say on this occasion is that we never know where a major in history is going to take us. And when I graduated, I did discover that there are different paths that I could take. But I wasn't sure I really wanted to commit myself myself to one of those. That wasn't something that you could determine at that age, that outlook, and so forth. So I continued to fumble and look and attach myself to different interests along the way. What I discovered was that history could take you in some very unexpected directions. I like to think that it is rooted in the society out of which we come. The things that perhaps we quarrel with in our lives, that we don't want to see perpetuated, or that we want to pursue a better understanding of. And so when the opportunity came along, I joined the Civil Rights Movement. And that was an experience in lived history. I discovered in the process of it the passion of young black students with whom I joined in an organization that is now commemorated for its radicalism, which wasn't that bad. But we were prepared to do embarrassing things if necessary, and we did. And then it led into some real serious, deep learning. I discovered more about the black community out of which they came. I discovered some of the history of other minorities in America at the same time. These paths are circuitous but interesting. And I also discovered that in the process, I was taking on a totally unexpected specialty. I couldn't be a civil rights agitator for the rest of my life, and I had no intention of doing so. That was too lopsided. What I did, because I was interested in the history of these things, I did follow it. And in the course of time, I wound up sitting on lunch counters with black students in Nashville, Tennessee, who were trying to get Walgreens and some of the other businesses with lunch counters to open up. And they had the little old ladies behind you that you couldn't see, telling you awful things about yourself, or sometimes saying, keep it up, keep going. So that was a learning lesson. At the same time, I learned to know a newspaper reporter from the New York Times who it's hard to know how to approach him. His name was David Halberstam. He was a magnificent reporter from Vietnam. He was a man who always, after the demonstrations, returned to his desk and started making notes and starting to write. And I went to the newspaper company offices and walked in on him while he was doing this, and had a wonderful seminar in how you approach the business of news reporting, which is historically significant, as this was. And I loved the point that just a few years ago, I was able to bring David to Illinois Wesleyan and hear him. He came down from Chicago was a ream of paper, which was the foundation for his next book, is on the Cold War in Korea. And there he was reading these dispatches from General Ridgway and in the car that he was commandeering and printing. But he told me that being a reporter for him was graduate school. It was his graduate school. And so we need to take seriously this learning from David that these jobs we have, they're sometimes onerous, sometimes necessary, but not things we like doing that much, but they are lessons in the way the world lives, the way the world fails, and the way the world succeeds. And he was a committed journalist of very high standards. And that book did finally get out, although on his next assignment in the area of Boston, I think it was, they sent him out to see, he was going to interview a famous coach. He always did a sports book in between his more serious efforts. And so he was going out there and they gave him a graduate student driver, which was the fundamental mistake. And he wasn't a careful driver. And David was killed in an accident that entered the freeway when he shouldn't have. And one of the great losses of my life has been the loss of connection with the most famous journalist I ever met. And that's the way history works. We encounter sources, things we didn't have any idea existed, parts of the community we don't know, parts of the society that we are not exposed to. And I enjoyed the fact that it took me to 2 different black universities, one in Nashville, and one in Raleigh, North Carolina. It gave me a chance, and standing outside the door, the entrance of the Black Women's University in Raleigh, somebody suddenly came around the corner, thrust out his hand to shake my hand. It was Martin Luther King. You just have to be in strange places sometimes to have these. And 2 nights later, I had a long conversation with his wife. He would hold my hand so long I was getting embarrassed, thinking that the rest of the people on the reception would throw me out. But those were major learning experiences. Learning does not just happen here. It happens out there. And we get invitations to things we're not sure we want to do or see perhaps. It's the larger society of which we are a relatively silent part. But it's a life devoted to history and to its progress. It took me, when my father got a position as the American head of the first secondary school, it's an American high school in Afghanistan. I got an opportunity to go there. And my mother did. My mother did. And that was a powerful additional, who expected that we would be going to Afghanistan? Along the way home. All of us.
So we are honored to have Professor Emeritus Bushnell talk to us about his experiences and to follow in his not inconsiderable footsteps. We invite Cassie to
Well, once again, I just want to thank all of you for coming, and I'm sure you're a little hungry now. There's food outside, and the opportunity to talk with each of our presenters individually. So thanks again for coming, and enjoy some refreshments. So thank you.